Hello and welcome. In this section, we will be talking about the basics of Unity and programming in general, because when we move on to making our game, we kind of don't explain how programming works and how methods that we will be using work. We assume that you know those things. So if you're a beginner in Unity, we made this first section for you so you can learn everything that you need to know and then continue with our game development. But if you're familiar with Unity, you can skip all this and just start with making the game. Okay, so this is how Unity looks like when you open it. We have our game view, and this is the scene view. In the game view, you basically is the feed of the camera. So what the camera sees is going to be shown here in the game view. Your scene view might not look like this. Mine looks like this because I clicked on this icon here and disabled the skybox. I just like it to be black like this. I also have this animator tab open here, but we'll talk about this later on. We can close it for now. And we have the asset store where you can purchase assets and things like that. In this course, we will provide you with all assets that you need in order to make a full game. So we'll be recreating the first Legend of Zelda. So we'll give you a character sprite sheets, enemies, environments, all assets that you will need. So here in my scene view, if I go to hierarchy, I can create game objects. And since I created this project as a 3D project, but it doesn't really matter. You can do the same thing in a 2D object. So if I go to 3D object and create a cube, you can see we have this cube here, and in our game view it's really far off to the distance. That's because it set its position to some random values. Let's center it. Now it's in the center, and you can see if I go to my scene view and select my camera, this is the game view that the player sees. But if I move this, we can see it here in the scene view, but in our game view we don't see it. That's because it's out of the side of our camera. Let's just put it back here. So this cube is a game object, and each game object has its own components. The most basic components that each game object will have is a transform. A transform is basically its transform in the world. So currently, each transform has a position, a x, y, and z, a rotation of x, y, and z, and a scale of x, y, and z as well. So currently, this object is sitting on 0, 0, 0 on each of these coordinates and has a rotation of 0, 0, 0, and the scale is 1. We can of course rotate this object by changing these values here, or we can, in the scene view, press E and rotate it however we like. We can also press W, a shortcut, to move it around, and we can press R to scale it. We can drag all of these axes in a direction to scale it up, or we could drag the center to just scale it on all axes. Now we can't see this cube too good because of the skybox, so I'm going to go to the camera, and here we have, if the camera will look at a skybox or a solid color, I will select solid color so we have a better view of our cube. I'll call this cube maybe game object 1. Moving on, this cube also has a mesh filter. This basically says what kind of mesh this object has, so we can change these meshes, but I'm just going to leave it at cube. And we also have a box collider. Colliders are basically components that allow a object to be interacted with. So if you have two objects with colliders, they will hit each other and they can't pass through each other. So now in our box collider we can edit the collider, and if I go to our scene view, we can actually see these green lines here. That's the collision of the sphere. So if an object would hit these green lines, it would stop moving. We can also increase this collider like this, but this isn't really a real. This doesn't look real like a collision like this, because an object would hit this, but there would still be space to get to the cube. We can just reset these values to their default ones by changing the size. And we also have the mesh renderer, which just tells what kind of material this has and things like that. Currently, this game object has the default material, but we can create a new material and slap it onto this game object. That's really easily done in our assets browser. If I right click and go to create and navigate to material and click on that, I will call this material game object 1 material. And here we have, first thing, what kind of shader does this material use? Shaders are a complex topic, so I won't cover them in this course, but we'll make sure to create a new course that talks about shaders in the near future. But basically we have all kinds of different shaders for different uses. For example, particles. We can add shaders on we can add materials on particles to create amazing looking particle effects. We have a whole course on particle creation where we recreate particles from The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, Wind Waker, Grand Theft Auto, and we actually take your feedback and create particles that you request from us. So you should definitely check that course if you want to learn how to create amazing particles. But for now, we will leave this shader to be standard. And I can just change this color to maybe black and bump up the metallic. And now if I drag this game object onto my cube, we will have this metallic cube. And we can also change these values here and see how the material changes on our cube. We can also bump up the smoothness. We can enable disable emission, but I'm not going to talk about this too much. I just want to show you how it works. And also, probably the most used component is going to be a rigid body. So we have a rigid body and a rigid body 2D. Basically, this component allows a game object to have to be in the physics world. So if I add this rigid body, we can apply force to this object. It can be affected by gravity. So if you check it out, it has a mass. So I can bump the mass up to maybe 50. And we also have use gravity enabled, which means if I run the game now, this game object should fall down anytime now. And you can see it's falling down because we enabled gravity. We also have the collision detection here, and we have the constraints, so we can freeze its position on one of the axis, and we can also freeze rotation, which is really great. You will be using this a lot, this component. So for example, if I create let's actually copy this game object, duplicate it, and I'm going to go to scene view and move it down, reset the rotation of this game object, and I'm going to now resize it. Okay, let me just see if we see it. We don't. Just going to pull it up like that, move it up. Okay, so that's going to kind of act as our ground. I will name it ground. So now if we go into the rigid body of this object and disable use gravity, this cube will fall onto it, but it won't stay there. It will actually push it down. You see, because it applied force and you see how they react in the physics world. That's because our ground has also a low mass, and that's how objects behave. But we can just set this object to be kinematic to be true. That means that nothing will move it. So you see now our cube fell down and it's standing there. These are kind of the basics of the inspector and the basic components. In the next lecture we will be talking about coding and the basic data types and things like that. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next lecture.